So, a big welcome to everyone to today's topic, a terrific topic today on ethics. Last week we did emotions and feelings. Today we look at some of the logic behind the ethical decisions that we make. And at the end, we can conclude, like last week, a discussion with literature and art and music and how they can tackle ethics of making right decisions and realizing that we're human and we don't always make the right decisions. So we need grace and forgiveness as Christians as well. So let's begin with the topic, thinking ethically, and we consider a range of ethical concepts and ideas about how we look at sources of ethics, ethical dilemmas, consistency, decision-making, ways of knowing. Ethics is important in critical thinking because when we think, we're not only gathering information, we have to be caring and loving and knowing how to share that information. And thinking is important in ethics, in that we have a duty not only to think logically, but when we make ethical decisions, we've got to gather the information, we've got to be fair about the balance of the information. We've got to communicate that information, not hold it back. So thinking and ethics go together very well. Ethics is also very important in classroom settings in that students are not only learning facts and information, but they're learning attitudes. They're observing one another, observing us, observing other teachers, and they're role modeling. They're learning all the way through. And sometimes we think that young children in preschool, year 1 and 2, early primary years, they're not doing so much ethical thinking. Sometimes I think they're doing way more ethical thinking. Us adults are often going along, that's the way it's always done. And it's the young children who are often asking the big ethical questions. And then we'll begin with a Bible reading, Colossians 3. Since you've been raised to new life with Christ, as Christians, we believe we can set our sights on the realities of heaven, the higher ethical standards with Christ at God's right hand. Think about the things of heaven, not the things on earth. You have died to the things of earth and you've been raised to new life with God in Christ. So put to death the immorality and put on the fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5, love, joy, and hope. And 1 Peter 3:15, in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord and be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, and do this with gentleness and respect. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we come before you today seeking your guidance as we embark on sacred responsibilities in teaching, and we recognize the challenges and responsibilities entrusted to us as we teach. We're mindful of the influence of our words and our actions on those we teach, and we ask for your help in developing a framework and an ethics to guide all that we do. We pray that we may be worthy of the trust that's been placed in us in these tasks in teaching. Today we have the forum post to begin with, the video by Dr. Michael Burrows on the significance of ethics in daily life, and then we have other resources. And if you want to be stretched a bit further, you can consider questions about the existence of evil, the nature of evil and good, what C.S. Lewis and others in philosophy have said about these. We all face ethical issues, as Dr. Michael Burrows said, in life and in schools and in decision making. And at times, we're all a bit tempted to push the barrier when we're driving and we're running late and it says 60. Can we go 62 or 63? What's the guideline here? Or should we be really good and go 58 or so? And so we often feel like pushing the barriers, don't we? How we talk, even attitudes. When we don't have a right attitude, do we express that? Do we keep quiet about it? We all face ethical issues every day and all the time, and all our students face ethical issues as well. Interested talking to the primary school teachers in that there's a lot of great books on ethics, and one of the ones that I really like is The Giving Tree. And in The Giving Tree, you have a little boy who goes to a tree and the tree gives him apples and he enjoys that. This is a great book to discuss. Later on, as you read through the book, the little boy grows up and comes along and says, I'm too big to climb and play in the tree and to eat an apple. Now I want to buy things. And the tree says, well, I'm an apple tree. I can give you apples. You can sell them. And so he sells the apples, and he makes a bit of pocket money out of it. And then as he gets older, he goes along and says, well, I don't just need pocket money now. I've got to build a house. So then he chops down the tree and carries it away and builds a house from the tree. And then when he's very old, he comes back and he sits there on the stump of the tree. And there's a long way from the tree that was something to enjoy in his youth and that which has been exploited. That's just one example of many books that can be discussed, and there's lots of other books that you could use to stimulate discussion. Ethics is there from preschool, primary, all the way through, and children are thinking about it. They're wanting to discuss it. One of the students said he found the TED Talk interesting. Ethics is something that we can teach, even outside of role modeling and incorporating it in our classroom. We need ethics in the decisions we make. We need to be teaching ethics. We need to be role modeling ethics. Daniel, how important is ethics in the classroom in terms of what we teach, in terms of the examples that we set, in terms of openness to discussion? Because often people want to close down discussions of ethics. Someone says, what about gay people? What about injection rooms for drugs? There's all sorts of ethical things, and a teacher might say, oh, this is a bit dangerous. They'll go home and talk to their parents. We might just move on to another topic. How important is discussion of ethics, openness to ethics, being authentic about the struggles with ethics that we all have? How important is it in the classroom, Daniel?
I think it's tremendously important. And I love what you brought up before, Sam, in the sense that I think primary school children do it a lot more than we probably realize. I think if you talk to any primary school teacher, or even just any staff member in a primary school about what their day was like and their experiences with children on that particular day, you're almost guaranteed to get stories of having to talk to children and navigate them through particular events or instances that may have happened either in the classroom or the playground. Things like, sharing resources in the classroom, playing fair at recess and lunch. An interesting thing that I saw in the primary school that's attached to my church is that they have their own rule set developed for handball, and it's called, school, insert school name here, and then, rules for handball. And it has about 10 rules that every student who wants to play handball has to kind of sign a contract and agree to, because it's such a contentious, activity. And so in that, there is obviously a sense of ethics that we've all agreed to this. Why is this important that we agree to it? Why is it important that we're all on the same page? But also, what are the kind of values, or what are the common ideas that we see in this that we can all agree on, right? Because these would have had to have been agreed on. So even just not even talking to those primary school students, even just walking through, I could see issues of ethics on display. And the reality is, I was going to relate it a little bit to my own experience with English and history in the secondary classroom, is that the reality is that ethics and the ability to make ethical decisions is something that we're all inevitably going to have to do. And so whether it's in history, for example, looking at events in the past, really traumatic events, things like the Holocaust, for example. Why is the Holocaust evil, right? It's why do we view that, and why is our understanding of that one, as being one of the most abhorrent events in human history? It's because it violates so many ethical principles of humanity. And so having an understanding of ethics helps us not only interpret information, it helps us get on with those around us, but I think as well, I see it as in many ways, a pathway to critical thinking, because it's when these topics come up in the classroom. Or what about, rooms for drug injection, or what about assisted dying, for example? Those discussions of weighing up the pros and cons of looking critically and thinking about those issues is something that we all have to do as adults, and it makes for informed citizens. I think informed citizens are ones who are open to and will deliberately make sure that they gather a variety of viewpoints and perspectives.
And as you say, Daniel, we're teaching ethics, whether it be a sports game. There's a lot of ethics going on in a sports game, whether it be the rules that we set for the classroom. And it's a good idea to discuss through with the students in your class. What do you think are the rules that we should have? Why do you think we should have these rules? And then put them up. These are the rules that we have agreed to, through to those big, horrendous issues of the Holocaust and events that are happening, and what are the responsibilities that we have when there are wars, when people are suffering. There's this huge range of ethical questions that children are wanting to wrestle with all the time, and they're wanting to understand what's the right thing to do in life. And school is a major place where people will be learning about that. And we as teachers are wanting to know about what's the right thing to do in the school, in our relationship with others in the school, with the school itself, with other teachers. It's so important to have an enjoyable, successful life, to have strategies for dealing with that. And that's what we want to discuss in today's lessons. What's the guidelines for developing an understanding of ethics that'll bring health and vitality and life to you as a teacher, and health and vitality and life to every student in your classroom. And some of the other readings for today, if students want to take time to read some of these other readings, one that I really liked was the one by Ehrlich, Kimmler, Millwater and Cranston, which talks about the ethical dilemmas that teachers face. And so we're always facing perplexing situations. You're marking students, and that one student's not done so well and they'll fail. Do we up their mark a little bit just to get them through? Another student has done highly well, but have they had some help from somewhere? Do we mark them down? We're facing ethical issues all the time in our relationship to parents and others. Do you just put on a happy face, or do you share how you really feel? There's a lot involved in ethics, in the words we speak, how we speak, our attitudes, the way we approach life. Plato said that there are virtues, not just standards, but higher goals that we need. So instead of just ethics being about the basics to get by, he said we need the godly, heavenly revelations of what's the higher standard of hope and faith and temperance and courage and prudence and justice, and these higher standards there. And so virtue ethics, I think, is a very valuable approach to ethics. And we see biblical ethics also has this emphasis, like the ancient Greeks, on higher standards. But beyond that, we also need some laws which say these are not only the standards, but we're going to write them down. But what happens when there's a conflict between the laws that are written down, and the laws say we've got to do this, but what happens if we've got to run off out from school and help someone, or if we've got to step outside those laws? We mentioned speeding before. What happens if we've got to rush a bit faster to help someone for a medical emergency? And so we need this balance in ethics, and so we need to understand all of the different components, such as the high goals that we have and the virtues we seek, the laws and policies that need to be written down. But then how do we respond when the laws don't quite fit the situations? One study has identified some of the major dilemmas facing teachers, and we might be able to identify with some of these. And Daniel, you might think, what are the major dilemmas facing teachers? This study said that, firstly, how do we deal with students That is marking grades, confidentiality, how we speak to them, how we respond to them. Secondly, there are the conflicts that occur when a student wants one thing, another student wants something different, we want something another, and cheating would be an example. And then there are those who are short people rather than tall people, or those who are coloured people, or those from different backgrounds. So there's minority groups, there's gender, there's all sorts of reasons why some people seem to be included and others left out. And we believe it's a biblical principle that God's given us a sense of equality. And then there are also the balance between the rules and then when the rules don't seem to work. What do you think are the major issues that teachers face, Daniel, and how do you deal with them? Do you pray? Do you talk to a friend? How do we answer these dilemmas that we face?
Yeah, I think at least in my experience, I think the main one was probably student behavior. So I worked in the public system, and I had some really great classes, but I also had some really challenging classes. And I think the big ethical dilemma that would often come up is to what extent do you follow up on negative behavior? To what extent do you implement certain dare I say, not punishments, but consequences for poor behavior? And I think the reason why that was, at least for me, such an ethical dilemma was I recognized that for a lot of the students in one of my particular difficult classes, they were all students who really just did not want to be at school. And they weren't quite at the school leaving age yet to be able to leave. So I recognized that they're already having to come along to an environment that they really don't want to be in, and an environment in which they're going to leave as soon as they can. So in what way might it be in their best interests to make this experience for them more negative by giving them particular consequences? And so I think the workaround for that was trying to go, I think, a bit earlier in the process and go back to a little bit of what the classroom expectations were. And maybe, I think, with that class in particular, recognizing that because of that context, maybe those consequences for those students might be different for certain behavior than, say, for students who exhibited that behavior who were in a gifted and talented class, for example, who, wanted, for the most part, definitely wanted to be at school, wanted to learn, and really understood the expectations and the culture of the school as well. And so that was, I think, my biggest ethical thing was we're told as teachers one of the standards is know your students and how they learn. And part of knowing your students is knowing that they all come from a diverse range of backgrounds and that they have a diverse range of hopes and desires and anxieties. And so, we talk about differentiation. And sometimes we have to differentiate a little bit with our expectations and classroom management. And I think that's difficult in the sense that you can think to yourself, man, is this necessarily fair, that I'm not enforcing the same behavioral expectations in this classroom that I would in that classroom? But again, it comes down to your students.
And I think we need to take time to talk through with them that there are eventually going to be consequences for learning maths, learning English. They'll go on and do a trade, they'll go on and do a job, and there are benefits. And I think there is importance to take the time to talk through, this is what we're doing, this is what we're expecting. We're expecting self-control. We're expecting discipline. We're expecting self-discipline. And so all of these things are things that are being practiced and learned, and taking the time to talk through and to listen. and to value them. Because one of the things that I think often these students who've got lesser ability and less interest may find is that they're not being valued and they're not being listened to. The bright students are being valued, but not them. So I think you're right. I think behavior is one, confidentiality and being fair is another, and also recognizing diversity is another, and then recognizing those rules. So there's lots of resources that students can work with if you're interested in that. One of the first questions we might ask is, what do we mean by this topic, ethics? Certainly the phrases are thrown around all the time: end justifies the means. It's the right thing to do. If it feels good, do it. Do to others as they do to you, as long as it looks good. So there's lots of phrases that are thrown around, and I would encourage the students to pause the video at this stage and to write down, what does ethics mean to them? What are some of the components of ethics? I think certainly ethics is both about heart attitude. Ethics is certainly about the good, but how do we establish what is good? Ethics is what I know about right and wrong, can even involve my feelings and my conscience to tell me what is right and wrong. So certainly it's about right and wrong. It can be doing right by our religious beliefs, by what the law requires or society accepts. Now, it's true that ethics is partly about feelings, but it's more than feelings. It can be partly about religion, but it's more than religion. And one of the problems with religion, politics, culture, or any group is that there can be in-groups and out-groups. And so if you're the in-group, you can treat the other out-group poorly, whether it be a religious group or a political group or a cultural group. And that's certainly not ethical, is it? I mean, ethics only works if everyone is treated equally. Ethics can do with law, but law's not going to tell us everything about ethics, and it can have to do with what our society accepts, but that's still not getting to the core of what ethics is about. So in any essay you do, it's a good idea to go with some definitions. I encourage you not to go too much with a dictionary. What are your thoughts on a dictionary quotation, Webster's says, or whatever? I don't like dictionary quotations because I find that they're a bit flat. I like a scholar who says. You know, Anderson writes, the study of ethics is what ought to be, not what is, what ought to be done. So I like definitions like that. You know, it's the standards we should organize our lives by. What sort of sources would you like in an essay, Daniel, if you're doing an essay? Are you happy with dictionary definitions like Webster's, or do you prefer a good scholar, a recent scholar? Thoughts?
I mean, I'm not unhappy with the dictionary definition, but it pales in comparison, in my mind, to a scholarly source. And the reason being is that there are different audiences, right? A dictionary is put together for everyone, you know, to be able to read and understand, whereas a scholarly article has been written by a leading academic, one who is an expert in the field that they're writing about. And when they provide their definition, it's not done in such a way as to kind of provide a general kind of basis for this particular word. It's done to actually posit and draw out a really sophisticated understanding of what this topic or what this word means based on research. And so I very much prefer a journal article or even an academic book or book chapter for the reason that the definition provided is a definition provided in the context of making an argument or proving a point. It's, you know, for an academic audience. It's not just a general definition for the general public.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that a scholarly article like Arthur Holmes' Ethics Approaching Moral Decisions is written for those who are committed to and interested in these big questions relating to moral decisions. It's not written for everyone in the country of every age, from early primary through to whatever. It's more specific. And Arthur Holmes says ethics is about the good. It's about values, virtues that need to be cultivated. It's about the right. And we've said that there's two types of ethics. There is the standard that is, but then there is that which is the ultimate goal that we go towards. Plato talks about this heavenly goal, and the Bible talks about God revealing higher, bigger goals that we may not yet have attained to. Now, morality differs a little from ethics in that it's often what people are doing already, whereas ethics is the goal of what should be done. And so in your school, in your classroom, in your life, you can set goals of what should be done. And to do this, you then need to think through what is the reason for doing it. And so when it comes to reasons for doing things, there are a number of reasons that can be set. And some of the lenses or reasons or theories are to do with how we understand ourselves as people and the world. The first one is called the rights, human rights. In Genesis 1:27, if God creates humans, people in his own image, in the image of God, male and female, then they have ability to think, ability to make responsibility decisions, ability to understand. Therefore, they have opportunity to make very good decisions. But at the same time, the capacity to make very good decisions means that you also have a capacity to make very bad decisions. And so Genesis 3:4-5 begins to discuss the very worst decisions that can be made. And so the Bible wrestles with this, and good literature wrestles with these questions of good decisions, what is good, and bad decisions. So the first one, the theory, is the human rights. That is, humans have a capacity to make right decisions, but it also means they can make wrong decisions. And these rights can be the right to make one's own choices, the right to be told the truth, the right to be not injured, to be protected in terms of sexuality, the right to have your property protected. They're included in the Ten Commandments. They're included in many of the statements on human rights. Now, some of these could be debated, but that's a very good way of understanding. This is sometimes called the deontological approach, deon being Greek for duty. So if we as human beings have a capacity to make good decisions, we have a duty to make the best decisions we can. This can then lead us to the justice decision. And under a justice decision, then we either get our due, which is we do good, we get rewards, we do badly, we get troubles. And this can lead to equality of treatment. Everyone who does good gets the rewards, everyone who does badly gets the troubles. However, this raises two questions. One is, should we just treat everyone equally, or should we realize some children are younger than others, some are older, some are shorter, some are taller? Should we take differences into account? And secondly, should we realize that we don't always get it right? So if you get a lower grade in a paper or fail, should you have the opportunity to resubmit? Should there be levels of grace and forgiveness? So Daniel, with this idea of justice and rights, to what level should we balance that with a Christian approach of grace and forgiveness? As Christian teachers in the classroom, we establish our rules, we establish the guidelines, and then someone misreads the question and does an amazing essay, but it's entirely on the wrong topic. Do we fail them and they repeat the year? How do we balance this rights with the other ways of looking at things?
It's almost a case-by-case scenario, because I feel like it comes back to the student, where you know they're at, how they are going in that particular subject, what strengths they might have demonstrated already. The beautiful thing these days about assessments is that every assessment has marking criteria. And so what I try and do is, in that type of situation where a student has, written an amazing essay, but they just haven't answered the question, or they've answered a completely different question, is I'll say, all right, what kind of marks, can I give them based on the amazing things that they've done? Even though they've answered a different question, have they maybe covered some of the, um, relative ideas or theories that were pertinent to the actual question? And so that normally gives me a bit of help in that regard. But if they haven't, I think what I normally think about in terms of judging, well, in terms of balancing justice and mercy and grace, is to think about what scenario will help them learn and grow the best. And more often than not, that usually means if they're an exceptional student who's just made a one-off, if they're a really good student who's made a one-off error, you say, okay, that's all right. We'll give you a 50 or a 55. Obviously why you're getting a low mark here. Now, if they're a student who might be receiving a really low mark because they've submitted something so late with no excuse, I think in that circumstance, I would be inclined to not be as generous with that grace, because I think that needs to be a formative experience. I can tell you that I've learned the most from my failures.
Mm.
I think humans in general learn the most from their failures, and failure is a good thing. I think we should all aim to fail at things now and then, because that's how we learn. And so I think ultimately it comes down to what scenario is going to help them learn and grow the most. It might be the 50% resubmit. It might be, or, resubmit for a maximum of 50%. It might be, all right, take 55% and, take it in stride. You know where you went wrong, and not how not to do this again in the future. Or it might be, look, at this point, seeing that you've submitted so many things late without reason, there needs to be, hard cutoff, so you recognize that you can't go through life doing this. So I think that's what it comes down to, is what is going to be best for that student's growth.
I really like what you say there about acknowledging the value of failures and failures as opportunities to grow. There is a Jewish view on the fall as falling upwards. That is, every time you fall downwards, there is the chance to learn and to grow and to turn it around and to fall upwards. Because I think you're right. If you just give the student the grade but don't get them to acknowledge where they've gone wrong, and the same in sport, you just let the student go with the bad practices, they're never going to improve. And as a matter of fact, it's the acknowledging of failures that helps us to grow. And that's true in ethics as well, is that as we acknowledge that we are human, therefore we misunderstand, we mishear, we act poorly. Every one of these is an opportunity for growth through recognizing, and that's the important thing that you make, Daniel, is that we've got to recognize the reasons we grow. Less individualistic approaches to ethics include the utilitarian understanding, how does it impact everyone? And so I think it's worth talking about to the class. You may want to be able to eat the whole of the cake when no one's looking, but everyone else misses out. You may want to yell at the top of your voice and to turn desks over or whatever, but this disrupts everyone and they lose learning time. And you multiply 5 minutes learning time by 20 students or 30 students, you get a lot of learning time lost. And so consequences in terms of the utilitarian lens asks, how's it affect everyone? And so we need to have rules and laws that balance the good of all over the harm that can be done. And so we can see on a bigger scale in corporate action, the customers want one thing, the employees want another, the shareholders want another, the environment needs another. You've got to balance everything. And so utilitarian says that we need to consider everyone and everything that is involved. So that's another important aspect of ethics. This is sometimes called consequentialism. So what are the consequences of one's actions? And we can put that up as one of our classroom guidelines. It's also sometimes called teleology, that what's the end point, what's going to be the final outcome. Another ethical approach is the common good. And we might think about talking to the class about what is the common good for the class. If we have these stresses and problems, then it's not going to be a happy environment. But if people do the right thing, if people speak kindly and quietly, then we're going to have a very happy environment and everyone is going to be better off. So we live in community with others. We have to learn those guidelines. As we said before, these can be just basic guidelines. If we want the higher guidelines, we need to think, what's the ultimate best good? And this is called virtue ethics. That is the virtues that God gives, or the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle talked about these virtues that come from the heavens and from the gods. These virtues can include the golden average. Sometimes you've got excesses, you go one way or the other. And so what one person calls being foolhardy and risky, riding a skateboard a certain way, another person can call brave and adventurous. And so you've got these different understandings of courage. And so you've got to think through what's the balance here. Yes, you can skateboard if you've got a helmet on, if you've got pads on, and if you're doing it in a thoughtful way and you're considering the experience level that you have. And so the golden mean recognizes that extremes, one way or the other, eating too much, eating too little, we need to eat just right. So some of the virtues from the ancient Greeks through the Middle Ages include discipline, that is self-control and moderation. We don't speak too loud, too quiet. We speak in a moderated way appropriate to the place. Courage. We discipline our desires. We're not too cowardly. We're not too forthright. Prudence, that is, we balance up thoughtfully the different goals that we have. And then justice, we've spoken about, you get good if you've done well, you get trouble if you've not done well, but we also need a measure of grace and opportunity to learn from our failures in order that we might take risks. And then the Bible talks about God-given graces of love. That is, we show love to one another and speak in love to one another. Hope, we recognize that there is a better hope, and then we have faith in God and faith in one another. So that makes a list of 7 or so virtues that we can promote. Other ways that we can look at ethics include care. So we must care for one another, care for our environment, care for our classroom, tidiness, so there can be rules of care. Another one is emotionalism, recognizing that it's not only wrong in terms of consequences, but if you hurt someone's feelings, that can be wrong. So we need to consider emotions. We've spoken before about law, so we need to write down, this is what we agree on, but we need to allow for review. What happens if there is a complexity in the case? We could speak about natural laws, which it seems natural that if you do the right thing, you get rewards, wrong thing, you get the punishment. Divine command recognizes that God can speak and reveal his ways to us. Situationalism recognizes that there are situations in which circumstance can vary from one to another, and we may need to consider situations. We may need at times to be pragmatic. And so class coming to an end, we've still got 10 minutes of work. We've got to pragmatically think, how do we balance? Students need to go, but at the same time, we need to cover the material. We need to recognize that cultures can be different, and how do we understand all of those differences? So these are strategies that can be used, but we also need to recognize behind these strategies are the values that we hold. So you and I have particular values that drive us and drive our ethical decisions. So values are right at the core of our heart's desire. Some of them are individualistic, that is, I desire things that feel nice for me. Others are values of the community. I realize I have to moderate that because I live in a community. Russ Harris has written a book on acceptance and commitment, in which he says we have to accept that we live in a society in which there are other people. We have to accept that we have to moderate our voice. We have to fit in with laws and times, all of those things. And then we can make commitments to ourselves and our values and the places that we live in, and we'll have a happy life if we do that. And there's a lot of worksheets that he's put out on how you can go from struggling and suffering to a rich and meaningful life by following some of these strategies. And you can download some of these values if you want to Google Russ Harris and values there. You can recognize the positive values of security, equality, fairness, respect, and what they mean. And in education, values of the norms that we have, the standards that we have, and character as well. You can ask questions about other values you have, what interests, what opportunities, hobbies you have. And I think it's worth us thinking, Daniel, about you and I, what are our values? And I encourage the students to pause the video and to write down, what are the core values that you have? Daniel, do you have some thoughts on core values that drive you? For me, education has emerged as one that is information. I love collecting books, information, because I feel knowledge is powerful, whereas other friends I know say relationships is what it's all about. Hug one another, and it doesn't matter if there's a little less knowledge. What matters is that we all have happier relationships. Others I know say it's not just relationships, it's feelings. And then others I know is that it's getting the task done. So it's not just learning about maths, it's getting 20 questions done instead of 10. What are some values that are high on your list, Daniel? Some people are sports oriented. What are values for Daniel?
I say I've got a good mix of those, and throw in, I'd say I'm particularly sport orientated, and I quite enjoy. I didn't used to, but I quite enjoy artistic endeavors and making things that are pleasing to the eye and aesthetically pleasing. And in looking at some of those values there, I value education. I'm like you, Sam. I like collecting a bunch of books, and I try and be as well read as I can, but I also want to. I think for me, it's important. It's equally important to know what I don't know as much as possible, if that makes sense, to be aware of the gaps in my own knowledge. And I think I certainly, as I have gotten a little bit, I'm in my early 30s now, and I would say that at this period of my life, I think I've started to value relationships and feelings a lot more. But it was interesting seeing you pop up that kind of task-oriented value there, because I recall early in my marriage, I would, and this goes back to the way I, was kind of brought up, and I was brought up with the notion that as soon as you use a utensil or like a bowl or a plate in the house, you wash it up. Like it's, you don't leave it out, you go and wash it up. And what would happen is my wife and I would be kind of sitting on the couch, we'd be watching TV with dinner, and I'd finish and I go, okay. And I go to get up and put I'd pause whatever show we're watching, and I'd go to get up and put it in the sink. And my wife started saying to me, you don't have to do that straight away. And actually, when you pause it and get up and put leave the room and take your plate out, the message that kind of sends is that the cleanliness of the plate is more important than the relationship time that we're spending together. And so that was an interesting, I think, example of saying, oh, wow, we obviously have different values here in terms of, that task orientated and the importance of, relationship time and feelings as well. And so that was an interesting example. And so you'll be pleased to hear now, Sam, that I never put away dishes in the middle of our evening time together.
And this reminds us that every teacher and every classroom is going to have different values. And it's worth recognizing that your values may not be the same as the teacher next door. They may not be the same as other people. And as you say, in a family, there can be these different values. And so one of the benefits of working through an activity such as the Russ Harris activity is that you can look at those values that are important or less important, and they're online. There's lots of values that you could print cards off and get the students to draw pictures of and to talk about what are the values of their household, what's the values of their culture, what's the values of different members of their family, father, mother, why are different values held by different members of the family, and how do we balance these different values? Different jobs may require different values. So I think it's very important for every teacher in every classroom and every school and staff room to recognize there may be different sets of values going on, and there are benefits and limitations in these different values. So ethics wrestles with not only the absolute goods, but there's so often conflict between, there's tensions between the good of cleanliness and the good of being relaxed and having less pressure on. And ethics is not just about absolutes. Ethics is very much about conflicting values and how we resolve those conflicting values. You mentioned before the students who come in and their value is to be out skateboarding. They see more future in skateboarding than they do in a maths class. And so they're not at all happy when your values are being imposed on them when they've got other values. And it's important then to talk through skateboarding's a value. But there is also going to come a time when you want some maths and other things as well. So it's important for you to think through what are the values. And some teachers are very ordered and some are more creative and enthusiastic. Some are very expressive and some are quiet. And this doesn't make one more right than the other. Some are teamwork oriented, others are individual oriented. Some are highly organized and reliable, others are a lot more just feeling and caring and maybe a little less organized. And so having values cards, having a reminder of values can be very important. You might want to put up on the board in the classroom, these are the values that we hold. You might want to have a value of the week. You might want to reflect on the values of the school. But at the same time, it's important as well to talk through and think through what are the reasons that different ones hold the values. Do students consider that there are other values that there should be? In terms of values, we might want to think of goals as well. What's good and desirable? We may not always hit the goal, but we can move towards the goal. So we personally can reward ourselves. We might have goals in terms of food and exercise, in terms of study, in terms of grades. It's important to be realistic. It's important to work towards improving. Someone might have something that they're struggling with. A goal can be to improve, to overcome some of those difficulties that we face. So there's lots of resources out there that you might want to look to that talk about these different values that people have. You might want to think about the ways in which you can also develop a framework for making decisions. That is, how do you weigh up initially some of the issues, safety, bus leaving on a camp, you've forgotten the first aid kit, how far away are you, climbing a tree or not, crossing a river or not, canoeing or not, parental forms. We're making decisions all the time, and we've got laws to help us, but also we've often got tensions that are coming through. So we've got these dilemmas that we're facing all the time. So a framework, firstly, the first step could be we consider what's the problem, what are the tensions, and so do we have the first aid kit? If you've just left 5 minutes ago, you could turn around and go back. If you've driven 2 hours in the bus and you've forgotten it, then you got a different situation. You got to try and think through what are the options there. And we could also write down what are the ethical issues involved. And so there's a number of different issues here. You might want to write down, and this is helpful for the students. A student has 4 or 5 students have not done their work. We don't need to name them, but what are the ethical issues here? And we get the students to think through, to write down. This means that the class could be held back, because do we slow the class down for them to catch up? How could they catch up with us? Will they get further behind? And so discussing the issues can be important. We could rank the values. And so the student says, well, we went away camping for a week and I got behind. So that's a value, but that's conflicting with the value of needing to keep up with the maths and that which we're doing. So you've got to rank the values, gather the information. So you listen and you think through what's the information we have. In some subjects, it won't matter so much if you get behind, but in others, it'll be crucial if you get behind, if it's one that builds over the next 6 months. And then review the code of ethics we have. The code of ethics says you cannot move on to the next stage. You can't move on to the next year level until you have completed this. Then determine the options, select a course of action, and then put your plan into action. So developing a framework for ethics can be very useful, and I encourage you might want to work this through with the class, and then in the examples we have there, you could work through those different options that we have. So I encourage you to think through those different frameworks. And in the other example that I had before, there is a framework there. Santa Clara University Centre for Applied Ethics has a framework. It's quite similar, and it lists these different approaches that we might have as well. So there's lots of different strategies that we can have as well. Finally, though, I thought very interestingly, Daniel, is storytelling. Why is storytelling useful for approaching this topic of ethics, bad guys, good guys, why people do dumb decisions? How often does the author of a story introduce ethical tensions in order to get us on the edge? And what can we learn? And even in the Bible, we've got many stories that give us ethical tensions. What's the value in literature, Daniel, of ethics and ethics in literature?
Well, as a former English teacher, I'd be in a lot of trouble if I didn't say that it's of exponential value. But it's interesting in thinking about this because, I mentioned in our last lecture that when I talk to students about books they've read or films they've watched or TV series that they've watched, and I say, well, think about the ones that are most memorable for you. And more often than not, the texts that are most memorable for us are ones that have good character and good story. It doesn't matter how, wonderful the description might be on a page. It doesn't matter how brilliant the CGI is or how explosive that action sequence was. They can certainly entertain us, and they make for great entertainment in the moment, certainly. But in terms of texts that stay with us, it's to do with character and story. And it's interesting in considering the role that ethics plays in narratives as well. There's a kind of story or narrative treatise in screenwriting, jokingly referred to as Save the Cat. And the idea is that if you want to have a likable protagonist early on, you need to show them making a good ethical decision. And the idea is that, you have them save a cat, dangling from a tree, or you have them helping a child, or all sorts of things. You need to show them making a good ethical decision, because that means that the audience will want to root for them. So it's baked into the narrative of screenwriting. But I think if we look at texts in general, I think literature and film and TV, but literature specifically, has always been an implement by which authors critique and explore the human condition. And a result of that is that they want to look at and examine and often critique various ethical issues and dilemmas. If we think of the rise of the novel during the Victorian era in the 19th century, the most famous novelist of that time was Charles Dickens. And his work is particularly famous for his criticism of child labor laws in England that allowed children as young as 6 and 7 to be working in factories and mines. And even within those stories, he has these characters who are children have to navigate ethical decisions. Like, in Great Expectations, the main character has this kind of decision as to whether he dobs in a robber or not. If we look across the Atlantic, if we look at Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, that was a novel that basically exposed for many American readers the abhorrent nature of slavery, so much so that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, that he jokingly referred to her as, this little lady that started the Civil War, basically. And so literature has always been used as a tool to examine and critique ethical issues and dilemmas. And in knowing that, we as teachers, whether we're in the primary school space, whether we're in the secondary space, regardless of whether we're English teachers or not, I think it's important for us to recognize that texts, especially the texts that your students are engaging with, what Netflix series are popular, for example, can be really useful information to have up your sleeve. These will all explore and examine core ethical issues. And I wonder if the students in thinking about this can think of recent films or TV series that they've seen where there's a very likable character, and think about what kind of save the cat moment did they have early on. But these are all useful tools and useful texts to help us, to expose those issues, to make us think about, these ethical ideas and dilemmas, but also in looking at the characters that we may identify with, that we may root for, to think, how did those characters navigate those issues? How might that serve as a blueprint or a template for us as well? So for students in particular, in primary school, like we saw with that tree narrative, it can be so useful.
Well, one of the very interesting things is that we do face the reality of the character. That is, they often have a few flaws. How does having flaws help to present a character who is real? And how does it help us as Christians relate to the character in that they're not perfect, they're carrying temptations, they're even giving in a bit to temptations at times? How does having flaws in characters in literature help us to identify with what is going on, and even having some good characterizations in the villains as well helps
Yeah.
carry the story forward? How does that help, do you think?
Well, it makes them relatable, and it makes them relatable because we can see that these characters are dealing with, a lot of the time, the same struggles or the same wrestlings that we're dealing with. And so it feels like, in many ways, that we see parts of ourselves on the page or on the screen. And I think having, imperfections in characters are not just important for that relatability, but again, reinstating that idea that I think it reinforces the fact that you don't have to be, or that no one's perfect, and that you don't have to be perfect to navigate difficult things, to overcome difficult things. And I think in villains as well, my favorite villains are ones that you can understand why they're doing what they do. That you can
Yeah.
understand, you know what, I don't agree with, this 1980s villain. There's a great film called The Rock, where a former US Army, I think, colonel, takes over the prison of Alcatraz and, is threatening to launch nuclear warheads with his codes or something like that. I can't remember much of the plot. But he's doing it, and this is why I remember it. This is the key thing with ethics. He's doing it because he's trying to extort the government for money so he can pay the soldiers that used to serve under him, because they've missed out on all their disability pensions and welfare and all that kind of thing. So that it's like, I don't agree with what he's doing, but I understand why he's doing it. These men who've served under him have been through hell, and they haven't got all the benefits, and they haven't been looked after by society. And that makes him a really interesting villain, because there's a little part of our brain, I think, that goes, yeah, I get that. I get that.
Yes, yes. And this fits with the biblical message and the Christian message. We see in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, and everything is going well. And then we see trouble. And then we see the possibility that God might be with them and things might get better. We see Genesis 12 through to 35. Things are going along for Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob, but there's challenges. And then we see it, Joseph, he means for good, but he's a bit arrogant, and he gets thrown into a pit. And then all the way through the biblical message, we see that there are people who try to do the good thing, but they fail a bit, whether it be Peter in the Gospels or Paul in the Gospels. And the Christian message is that there is grace, that there is forgiveness, but you do need, it's the prodigal son has to be one of the classic stories in the Bible, doesn't it? In Luke 15, whereby he has an opportunity to turn around. And that's such an important message in the classroom too, isn't it? Is that our students won't necessarily always do perfectly, but if we listen to them like the father to the prodigal son, we're welcoming back, like God the Father in the biblical message and the Christian message, God is there to welcome us back if we repent and turn, and if we commit to doing the right thing. That's the ethical message, isn't it? But it's also a message that we don't just do it because it's law, like the oldest son in the prodigal son. We do it because we have a heart for what is right and good. Hey, I've really enjoyed today's class on ethics. It really gives me some guidelines as to I want to do the right thing. I want to do the right thing as a teacher, but I have the freedom to recognize my values may be a bit different. There are reasons why I've got to fit in with the others in my school. other teachers, but at the same time, I can hold to my values to some extent as well, and that my students too, I value them, I listen to them, I recognize their differences, but we do need some laws and some guidance as well as to what are the standards that we're going to take to. So I look forward to talking with the students about today's lesson. It's been great. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, students. It's been terrific again today. Thank you.